All right. I think we're live on both. I apologize if you got a couple seconds of me staring off or whatever. Um, and also just for being late. Taking care of something at work, and I guess I sort of missed my little 5-minute warning to myself. So here we are. Welcome back. Nice to be able to talk to you guys again this week. My name is Dennis Misigoy, Libertarian, running for the U.S. Senate seat here in Florida. And I'll just go ahead and start catching up on some things, man. I want to talk about, well, let's see. Definitely not internal LP stuff. Let's see. This week, the beginning of this week was Martin Luther King Jr. Day over on Monday. They're definitely not a libertarian, but I think there's certain things instructive and informative that we can take from both his example and his experience. One of the two things, I guess, that I would probably, if I was going to emphasize anything, one would be the attitude towards unjust laws. It's a thing we definitely talk about amongst libertarians, which is actually really important for us, which is the recognition that not only are the laws not, under any circumstances, the laws of men should never be assumed to be moral or correct, and as such, the question then becomes, what is the responsibility of every person, every moral person particularly, in the face of laws that are unjust and laws that cause undue harm to people who, for whatever reason that they're targeting them, but for people who have not actually violated anyone else's rights, where cause cannot be really justified in that same sort of way, in the way that we would traditionally think. And it's that goes to that sort of simple adage we have where we say, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Those are really the things when we talk about what is a just or unjust law. Obviously, when someone violates another person's rights. But what we tend to see a lot of is where government violates people's rights, typically with justification of things there where the person wasn't doing any of those things. And we can talk about all the sort of prohibitions, occupational licensing, where people get shut down for different things, all the different areas through which government tries to exert sort of control over us. Certainly I'd talk about policy in other areas. You get into more egregious things when you talk about, our Obama/Trump/Biden internment camps for immigrants, etc., etc., and a lot of these other messes that, to me at least, it seems sort of pretty easy to look at these sort of policies and say, well, that doesn't seem quite right. That would be something I would regard as unjust and immoral acts by government, and the question is, even when that's the law of the land, assuming that it is, legitimately and legally, well, I shouldn't say legitimate, but legally, as per the other established laws that are broadly recognized, what should be our stance with regards to those? And to me, there really shouldn't be much question that we do everything we can to fight and upend those. The question really anyone needs to ask themselves is what obligation that they have to uphold laws like that when they are discernibly unjust. We can have debates about which laws are more so that, but I think that as a baseline is very important for people to recognize. Another part that I think is just instructive about his experience is the fact that we had the way that he was targeted by the federal government, and particularly the FBI. It's come to light, obviously, in later years, after all the immediately involved parties, I think, are passed on to the next life. That J. Edgar Hoover and his sort of close circle of cronies were heavily obsessed with Dr. King. They were going after him, surveilling him, really going to sort of extraordinary lengths to target a guy who, let's be honest, was really, a public political figure, but he wasn't. It's not like you could justify it by saying he was some sort of organized crime leader or whatever. or even a agent of a foreign government, or whatever you could possibly try to justify it with. He was, you know, expressing political dissent and obviously fighting for civil rights. We, you know, most of us have been made somewhat at least familiar with the basics of his story and what everything that had gone on, in particular leading up to that era, and you know the position that he occupied. And they went after him like they went after a number of other civil rights leaders, to, like I say, some pretty extraordinary extent. At one point, where going through all of this the surveillance and whatnot, trying to use certain information to then literally try to blackmail the guy into committing suicide. And again, you can make whatever assumptions you want to about the actual actions that ended up taking his life, how he was murdered, and whether you want to assume that folks who were taking all these other extreme steps either had any hand in it, or at a bare minimum, I mean, if there was so much surveillance and so much tracking of them, would they have been aware of and made an effort to prevent someone from trying to kill him if they knew it was going to happen, or at least had some inkling of it? You can draw your own conclusions for that. We certainly know about them being involved in the killings of other civil rights leaders, folks like Fred Hampton. Again, not necessarily on our side of the political spectrum, but it's important to understand. And I think the part of the reason why I think that's important to bring up is to, number one, bring down the facade of government agencies, in particular this sort of federal law enforcement, as some sort of like apolitical, you know, force for good and doing nothing but the kind of stuff that we would see in you know, the classic sort of feel good kind of, I don't want to say feel good, but sort of police dramas that we would see where you know, it's all about, well, here's a crime, let's go after the bad guys and this and that. That's unfortunately not the reality of how people who have government power behave, in particular on the law enforcement side that we're talking about here, particular these federal agencies especially, I think. And it's important as people talk about it, you know, we're not too far still from January 6th. And as people look at what's going on with the January 6th investigations, I think it's something important for people to remember that it has been, as we're talking about with MLK, a time-honored tradition from the very beginning of the FBI to go after political opposition to the sitting establishment. That's what they were doing with Dr. King. That's what they're doing a lot with today. And it is, and I guess to kind of circle back over, or sort of transition over to that topic very briefly, it does sort of demonstrate how farcical and not serious this whole exercise is of these investigations, because there's so much information. We live in a time, again, that's remarkable, not just because I can do this and live stream, you know, from my desk and just kind of get this thing set up to where I can talk to you guys and communicate directly with you without having to go have you know, get picked up by a local television network or a national one or whatever, without having to have any real support. I can just talk to you guys directly using this kind of platform. Just the same way, you know, everybody's carrying around a camera, video camera in their pocket, so that now we have recordings of all these people who were instigating and doing other sort of suspicious things, sort of leading up to what happened on January 6th with the breaching of the Capitol. And when you look at some of these interesting characters, and obviously one of the more notable ones is the guy Ray Epps, who is seen on video multiple times repeatedly encouraging people, oh, we got to go into the Capitol. We got to go into the Capitol. Now here's a guy deliberately out there, very much instigating, kind of in the same way they want to say that Trump was actually instigating when there was just a rally and he was talking whatever about it. But here's a guy literally saying, hey, we got to go into the Capitol. And this guy's nowhere to be seen. He's not indicted. He's not wanted. They're not looking for him. They certainly don't have him in custody. Or maybe, again, you can draw your own conclusions about it, about him and some of the other sketchy figures. But if this was a serious, but if the investigations and everything were serious about this, this guy would be called in. This guy and some of these other characters who've sort of vanished, but we know about them because regular people, not the government investigation and all this stuff, but regular people have put the information together and they are talking about it. Again, because we have the ability today, something that we didn't have decades ago when this sort of thing would go on. To anyone who's not familiar with the term agent provocateur, I would encourage you to go look it up, read about it, and whenever you look at these sort of demonstrations, protests, riots, large events with masses of people, particularly where there's some sort of political element to it, political reasoning for it, I think it would be healthy to always work under the assumption that these people are there, that this kind of stuff is going on, and that and that what you see come out of these events and these people and in these situations, it's always important to take it, I don't want to say with a grain of salt, but maintain the perspective that not everything you're seeing is a spontaneous act coming from somebody in a particular movement, because we know that government has always had an incentive to undermine any sort of, I don't want to say popular uprising, but really any sort of movement, anything that's going on that they're not in control of, obviously is not something that they want to go on. The people who are in government because they are, generally speaking, I'll say with a few exceptions, but generally speaking, because they are attracted to the power that it allows them to wield. Now, someone like myself is trying to do this because I just don't want those people to have the power. So, but I think that's, from what I can observe, that is much more the exception. There are lots of people who do want power, and those are the folks who really are desperately do everything. They dedicate their lives to getting into positions where they can, and you can see for yourself what they've done with it. So, it is, quite a mess, and certainly with everything that's gone on with that and the sort of absurdity of it. But it's important to maintain that perspective that it is not, the folks who are pushing that are not serious about it, because if they were, they would be dragging in those guys. The whole "Where's Ray Epps?" there would be no mystery about it. He would be there testifying under oath, and we'd get the full story about this guy. But that ain't what's happening. So, and until it happens, I'm going to remain more than skeptical about that exercise. So, let's see, what else do we got going on? Excuse me. In addition, we have, let's see, we have everything that's going on with the push for, conflict with Russia over Ukraine. I haven't always been particularly well versed in it, and I still wouldn't say that I'm, the most in-depth knowledge. But, a basic kind of review of the history of some of this stuff is, again, just sort of shows why it's so out there. This push for conflict, unnecessary conflict, at a time, again, when we are rapidly approaching 30 trillion in debt, at a time when we are facing this these economic challenges here with inflation, record inflation, probably for at least the record of at least within a couple generations. I'm trying to think back. I don't know, other than a little bit before I was born, like late 70s, getting into the early 80s. Well, I was born in the early 80s, but other than that particular era, I'm not sure of another time when we've had, such an issue of inflation so pronounced. And even then, I'm not quite sure that it was necessarily driven quite by the same forces, but we're going through something now. that is intimately tied to the empire building policy of the last 20 years, which is pretty remarkable when you consider that all this came after the end of the Soviet Union, which is obviously intertied with this as well. There's so much talk about NATO and this idea of either Ukraine in it or not. Obviously something that for whatever reason the U.S. wants, which is, again, obviously a provocation to Russia, because this is bringing it right to their doorstep. And again, you've got to ask yourself, to what end, for what purpose? It's not as though, it's always funny when people talk about if the U.S. leaves from this, that, or the other place, they always talk about, well, who's going to come in and do stuff? And one of the ones that boogeymen that people always bring up is the Russians. Again, sort of evoking the specter of the old days of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union's been dead now for 30 years. In one of his lucid moments, Trump, in actually sort of getting something right, one of those was, I think, his questioning of what's NATO even for anymore? What are we there for? What are we paying for? Because there's no Soviet Union to contain. I don't remember the exact number, but I mean, the size of the Russian economy at this point is, I think, more comparable to a one of our largest cities like New York or something, more than it is to really being a competitor to the U.S. There's no, I mean, we nearly spend as much just in our military budget, just in what was approved for the NDAA, is relatively close to the size of their economy. So the idea that they're going to pose a serious threat, they are going to go after, that they're to pose such a threat, to demand actions like this and provocations, is just absurd. And again, within the context of everything else that we already have going on, all the problems that we have at home, which again are tied to this sort of expansionism and antagonism. One of the things, though, as I've been, sort of staunchly non-interventionist for many years now, but just in recently reading, and I would encourage everybody to do the same, Enough Already by Scott Horton. I didn't think I fully appreciated the depth to which there was just a disregard for the consequences in human, just absolutely terrible judgment from the leaders in our country who pushed for war in all these situations, who, in particular, in cases with Iraq and Afghanistan as well, who believed that they were going to achieve one thing or the other, or that the end result was going to be, a new Iraqi government, led by Ahmed Chalabi or something absurd along those lines. That these guys seriously expected that gives me a little bit of pause about what's happening right now. And the reason why is that one of the things I always look at is the fact that, as people always do this whole pushing for, nuclear non-proliferation, and they always try to make these deals with countries like Iran to say, hey, you can't have nuclear weapons, and try to get countries to give up their weapons. Of course, when we saw, for example, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who gave up his weapons, he decided, hey, I'm going to be totally cooperative, I'm going to join the team and be one of the, after 9/11, he was one of the first of, these people who had been formally antagonists who kind of said, look, I don't want to do that anymore. And of course, years after that, he was really betrayed by the West, who assisted in supporting the uprising that brought his government down and led to his murder, and obviously has plunged Libya into just horrible conditions. The country went from having the highest per capita GDP, per capita income, I can't remember exactly, but in Africa, but measurably one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, in 2011, just plunged into chaos and, hasn't recovered. And I mean, when I say plunged into chaos, for anyone unfamiliar with it, I mean, we're talking about uh, slave markets in broad daylight. Okay, that's the level that we're talking about here. It's important to maintain perspective that what kind of people have led, and certainly you can try to point to those being different administrations who've done each of these sort of things I'm referring to. However, the undercurrent of the um, you know intelligence foreign policy establishment, even under Trump he was still drawing from, but we're past the days of Trump, and even now, it's longtime career people, uh, like Secretary Blinken, and obviously this is a lot of what Biden draws from for his team is people that have been entrenched in the establishment for a long time. And it's interesting when you get a little bit more perspective to see, like I said, how poor their judgment was about Iraq and these other places and what they expected to have happen. And the reason, I guess, to kind of circle back, because I didn't really get to it, why it gives me pause today is because if they were wrong about that, then what else can they be wrong about, in particular in this scenario? Because perhaps they believe that there isn't as much risk um, of antagonizing Russia into, an all-out military conflict. If Russia is convinced by how far we're willing to go in terms of uh, getting a foothold in Ukraine, and trying to put NATO right on its doorstep. Once upon a time, the line for NATO, the do not cross line for NATO, and the old Soviet Union and that whole communist Eastern Bloc was Germany. It was in Germany, and now it's been pushed. They want to push it more than 1,000 miles over to Russia's own border, and there's additional significance to it. Because they're trying to, as part of what's there in question is an area, a city in Crimea, Sevastopol, which is like traditionally been the only year-round port that Russia has. Everything else freezes over during the winter, and it's an interesting history where you're talking about a region with Crimea in general. Part of we've been all contentious about for a good number of years here, which had actually been a part of Russia since the U.S. was still under the Articles of Confederation in like the 1780s, and only sort of nominally became part of Ukraine under the Soviet Union as part of sort of a questionable deal done under Khrushchev for reasons that I think are somewhat debated. But even at that point, it was sort of only nominally under Ukraine's administration because at that point it was all still part of the Soviet Union, which still all was centrally from Moscow. So it wasn't until the breakup of the Soviet Union was the first time that this region really was part of Ukraine and not Russia. And again, the question is, the history is interesting about this, but my point about pushing this line and antagonizing is, if these people have been wrong so many times about what the outcome of these other conflicts was going to be, if they're banking on the idea that they can bully the Russians into just accepting whatever they want to do without a real conflict, that really worries me about the possibility that maybe they try to bully Russia around. And it's still the fact that even if they're not the Soviet Union, and even if they don't have that military might and economic power and everything else, they do still have the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons of any other country besides the U.S. So that's not a trivial thing. And if that's something you have any concern about, it's something that should give you pause. And it would give you pause if you think, if we're going to create a situation where Russia becomes convinced that we're going after them, that we're, that we've got our sights set on eventually regime change over there, which, again, what else would be the point here? What are we fighting for, and what are we going to make these sacrifices for? Even if you don't necessarily think the worst possible scenario is going to happen, as I see Marco Rubio, our wonderful incumbent, sort of suggesting that we should be, arming and giving even more still. If you remember, Trump got impeached for taking a little too long to give military aid to Ukraine. And that's another interesting aspect to this, of that whole relationship between the Bidens, Ukraine, and the Trump impeachment, all of this sort of swirling around with Ukraine, and arming Ukraine and giving them aid and military aid. And it, again, to what end and for what purpose? And, all of this at a time as well where we are going through so much trouble over here, part and parcel because of the COVID policies that have disrupted our economy, this COVID spending, which is, ballooned the debt considerably and contributed hugely to inflation. But this is also still something that's been proceeding for the last 20 years, where trillion-dollar deficits became a norm, and again, the sort of foreign interventionism that the U.S. kind of shied away from after Vietnam really came back full force after we started the war in Afghanistan, after 9/11, I should say. I don't want to say like if that just came out spontaneously, but the war we were fighting and the wars that we have fought have been much more detached from dealing with stuff related to 9/11 than what they've told us the whole time. That's again stuff to get given some kind of rationale for this other conflict, because at the end of the day, what is Ukraine worth to the United States? How many lives should be sacrificed? How many dollars should be sacrificed? Particularly, again, at a time like this, when we're going through so many issues here at home. Again, what is the significance to us? Because the significance to Russia is a lot greater, I can tell you that. I heard someone in another conversation I was listening to, sort of talking about how someone might give them a hard time for saying the U.S. should back down and stay out of this. And they sort of likened it to, well, would you back out of, well, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis or something, which is an interesting analogy to bring up, not just because of the bigger context there, but because this is really sort of the reverse of that. This isn't Russia coming over here and looking for trouble and antagonizing and putting, something right on our doorstep. This is us going over there and literally putting something on their doorstep, with the case of the missiles in Cuba 90 miles away, in the case of the Ukraine, we're talking about sharing a border, sharing certain regions where in the area that I was mentioning earlier is predominantly Russian-speaking Russian people who would prefer to be part of Russia. Again, there's internal politics there that I don't necessarily think that should be the U.S.'s place to decide. And again, why should the U.S. be... well, I'll take it a step back and just say this: the policy of the U.S., particularly since the Cold War, has been to try to really establish this global hegemony and really assert its dominance as the world superpower, and nobody gets along without our say so, and that comes with a cost. That cost is borne by us, the regular American taxpayers, in a multitude of ways. And there are certainly people that are profiting from it, which are certainly going to tend to be a lot of the people who push for this, who support it. And it is on us to, as the people here, to try to step up and put a stop to it. So to not accept the push for war in here, or to even not support the sort of antagonism, to look past what they're telling you and the sort of fear mongering about it, and actually think back to the last 20 years and think about how much they've lied to us, how much they've misled us, what their track record is. It's always baffling to me when people look at the track record of government or aware of the track record of government and they still want them to do more. They still, whether that is, again, control and decide who should rule Ukraine or the Crimea or whatever, or as I heard, as I saw, it was a CNN headline, and thankfully, at least where I saw it posted on Twitter, it was violently ratioed, so that was encouraging to see. But it was something to the effect of should government set the prices of food and gasoline, which again, between the corruption and the incompetence, it's unfathomable that that someone thinks that anyone would consider that as an idea. So this is the challenge for us at this time, to look past. Not to look past, to look at what's happening and to resolve to take action, to take decisive action, to move us in a better direction. So I'm thankful to say that I can say that fundraising so far for the first quarter here, we're only a couple weeks into January, really, maybe I guess about 3 weeks into January, and we've already outraised what we got in the fourth quarter of 2021. Which may not be saying too much because of that, but we're doing good. We still got a ways to go. So if you guys can, please visit the URL. Please, visit the website. If you can contribute what you can, and because like I said, I can't do this alone. This is I won't even say don't even think of it as my campaign, because I am trying to bring out this message of liberty, of non-interventionism, of peace, really, at a time when we have a government that, even after getting out of the longest war in American history, still wants to stoke the flames of conflict and get involved, because this is just in their nature. This is what they do. And the only way it's going to stop is if we stop allowing it. So it's on us to take, like I said, a decisive action, we can't sit back and wait, because if we do, we know what continues, and there'll be a breaking point. As I said, there's a cost to these policies, and that bill is going to come due. And a lot of the people who pushed for it, and a lot of the people who got us here, a lot of them are already dead and buried, and they're not going to have to pay that bill. They're not going to have to deal with the consequences. Those of us who are here, those of us who are voting, and we look down at the younger generation, who are likely to carry that burden as well. Let's not let this go any further. We can begin to turn the tide, and it starts with displacing the establishment people who are going to continue us down this path. We cannot wait. As I try to say, change cannot wait. We've got to go now, even because it's a slow process as well. So I ask you guys for your support, your help, and I will talk to you guys next week. And thank you guys for tuning in. See you then.